In this video, we will configure another type of NAT translation which is more common compared to configuring NAT using a dedicated IP to a server. We will configure port forwarding using the WAN IP of our firewall and not using a dedicated IP address. So when someone from the outside tries to access our web server this time, they will use the IP of our WAN-facing interface followed by a port number. From the firewall, it will have a port mapping to our web server, so that session will be established that way. So to do this, under VIPs, we will create a new VIP. Let's go ahead and do that. And very similar to what we did before, we will enter a name for this new VIP. Okay. And the translated address will reside from our WAN zone. So we will select the WAN facing interface. For the external address, we will enter the WAN IP of our firewall. And we're going to copy it and apply it over here. Okay, for the mapped IP address, we will enter the IP of our web server. Next, we will enable port forwarding here at the bottom. Okay, so now our web server. So we know that it is only listening on TCP port 80 or HTTP. However, we want anyone that is connected on the lab internet cloud to use a different port number when accessing our web server. So we will use, we will actually map TCP port 8080 from the outside to TCP port 80 that our web server is only configured for. So to make those changes, we need to make sure that TCP is selected for the protocol, which is right up here, since HTTP is a TCP-based application. That's important. For the external service port, we will put in 8080. Okay. And the map to port would be port 80, which will map directly to our web server. Then once we're done, we're going to say OK to add this new VIP. Next, let's go to our policies page. And to clean things up, let's delete this existing WAN to LAN policy rule. Here we will create a new policy. Okay, and within this policy, any communication from the lab internet connected off of our WAN facing interface, communicating into the LAN interface, the source will be for any IP address on our lab internet cloud, and the destination address will be the new VIP that we created. For the service, we will select HTTP. Now this can be a little confusing because logically it should be TCP port 8080. However, the FortiGate is only looking at the mapped port, which is port 80 for a security policy. And further on, we're going to disable NAT as our VIP is already configured to do NAT port forwarding and we don't want to do any additional NAT. And that is everything. So let's go ahead and add this new policy. For testing, let's go back to our internet computer and let's open a web browser. Okay, and for the address, we will enter the WAN IP of our firewall followed by our port number of 8080. And doing that, we are connected to our web server. We can view this active session by going back to the policy monitor page. And there we will see one active session matched against policy ID number 3, which is what we added. Let's go ahead and check out the details of that session. This is the source of our internet computer. Okay, and there, let's move to the right. And there we can see the details of that session. So you will see that the destination port on the very far right is 8080, which is what our internet computer used for accessing that web server. However, since we configured port forwarding, it was mapped to port 80, the port that our web server is listening on. So that map port is reflected as the destination NAT port. It was this mapped port that we needed to allow within our security policy and not 8080. So that is how you can configure port forwarding on the FortiGate firewall.